Okay, we might make a start. Hello and welcome to this webinar hosted by the Australian Human Rights Institute. Our topic today is breaking the blockade. What would it take to end starvation in Gaza? My name is Jessica Whyte. I'm a Scientia Associate Professor in Philosophy and Law here at the University of New South Wales and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow. And before I introduce our panelist, Chris Sidoti, I would like to begin by acknowledging that this event is taking place on the unceded lands of the Bedigal, Bidjigal and Gadigal peoples. I would like to acknowledge the continuing connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to land, water and culture, and pay respect to all elders, past, present and future, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. As we meet here to consider the weaponisation of food in Gaza, we cannot lose sight of the fact that food and starvation have also been weapons of settler colonialism on this country. And I personally would like to express solidarity with ongoing struggles for land and justice. Now, I'd just like to give a brief introduction to the seminar, and then I will introduce our guest and we will have a Q&A. So back in October 2023, Israel's then Defense Minister Yoav Gallant imposed a complete siege on Gaza, announcing that those he termed human animals would receive no electricity, no food, no water, no gas. Since that time, Israel has restricted the entry of food into Gaza and at times prevented it altogether. On May 19th of this year, the Israeli Prime Minister's office announced that after blocking all food from entering Gaza for 11 weeks, it would allow a limited amount of basic food into the besieged territory. Earlier in May, the authoritative multi-agency Integrated Food Security Phase Classification had stated that Gaza's entire population is facing high levels of acute food insecurity, with 500,000 people, 1 in 5, facing starvation. It was not humanitarian concern that motivated the Israeli Prime Minister's decision to allow some food to reach Gaza's starving people. The move, he said, was necessary because a famine crisis would interfere with what he called the operational need to enable the expansion of the intense fighting to defeat Hamas. Following the partial lifting of the siege, Israel has established a new militarized aid system secured by private military contractors. Over the past month, the sites of the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation have become the scene of almost daily massacres. This morning, the Palestinian scholar Jihad Abu Salim wrote, "A new category of victims has emerged in Gaza, Muntadhiri al-Musa'adat." In Arabic, he wrote, it means aid seekers or those awaiting aid. Every day, reports come from Gaza of aid seekers killed or injured by Israeli fire. On June 22nd, the United Nations reported, and this is a quote, that since Israel eased its total blockade last month, more than 400 people are reported to have died trying to reach food distribution points. Jonathan Whittle, the head of the UN Humanitarian Coordination Office in Gaza and the West Bank, said, "We see a chilling pattern of Israeli forces opening fire on crowds gathering to get food. It shouldn't be this way," Whittle said. "There shouldn't be a death toll associated with accessing the essentials for life." Palestinians repeatedly report being fired on by Israeli forces, drones and tanks as they approach the sites run by the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. In the past 24 hours, at least 44 aid seekers have been killed around aid distribution sites. Yesterday, Stéphane Dujarric, spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General, said, "People are being killed just for trying to get food because a militarized humanitarian distribution system that meets none of the prerequisites because of a militarized humanitarian distribution system that meets none of the prerequisites for a functioning, fair, independent, and impartial humanitarian system. This week, a doctor in Gaza wrote of treating a mother for dehydration and acute malnutrition. She must stop breastfeeding, his colleague said. Yet infant formula is almost impossible to find in Gaza, Dr. Izzadeen reported, and even Nasser Hospital was on the verge of running out. Do not mistake this for a humanitarian emergency, he wrote. This is not a famine, it is a siege. It is not collapse, it is calculation. It is not neglect, it is intent. It is a real honour today to be here in conversation about the siege of Gaza with Chris Sidoti. Chris is a former Australian Human Rights Commissioner, and he is currently Commissioner of the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. Chris, welcome.
Thanks, Jess.
Chris, I'd like to begin by citing a report that the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry submitted to the United Nations Human Rights Council a year ago, back in June 2024. In that report, we read, "The Commission concludes that Israel has used starvation as a method of war, affecting the entire population of the Gaza Strip for decades to come, with particular negative consequences for children. This is a war crime. At the time of writing this report, children have already died due to acute malnutrition and dehydration. Through the siege it imposed, Israel has weaponized the withholding of life-sustaining necessities, cutting off supplies of water, food, electricity, fuel, and other essential supplies, including humanitarian assistance. This constitutes collective punishment and reprisal against the civilian population, both of which are clear violations of international humanitarian law." So that's the end of the quote. Now, 1 year on, the situation in Gaza is far worse than it was then. Can you talk us through the war crime of using starvation as a method of war and how the Commission came to the conclusion that Israel was engaged in that war crime?
The situation now, as you say, is far worse than it was a year ago. The report that you refer to was the first of 6 reports that we have published in the last 12 months, dealing with the events in Gaza, the West Bank and southern Israel since 7 October 2023. And without qualification, I can say the situation in all areas has only got worse, but particularly in Gaza. There are 2 areas that raise questions about Israel's violation of international humanitarian law in relation to the starvation policy. One is in relation to the responsibility of Israel as a combatant. Combatants are required to meet the requirements of the law of war, and the law of war says very clearly that there must be distinction between combatants and non-combatants, that is civilians, that there must be necessity and proportionality in the use of force and other forms of warfare, and that civilians must be protected. But there's also a second area of responsibility under the 4th Geneva Convention, where Israel is not just a combatant, but also the occupying power. Israel had long disputed whether it was to be considered an occupying power in relation to Gaza, but there can be no dispute whatsoever that since 7 October 2023, or shortly thereafter, when the Israeli offensive began, that Israel is, to all intents and purposes, the occupying power in Gaza. And the responsibility of an occupying power is not just not to harm the civilian population, but a positive obligation to protect it. Now, in relation to the practices of the Israeli authorities in starving out the people of Gaza, there are both war crimes and crimes against humanity in relation to Israel's role as a combatant, but also a failure of its obligations as an occupying power under the 4th Geneva Convention. Simply put, Israel is required to protect the civilian population of Gaza, not to harm it. And it's hard to imagine any form of harm more serious and more widespread in its impact than the starvation of the population. This is clearly intentional, clearly a deliberately strategy of war, and it is having an enormous impact on the people of Gaza.
Thank you, Chris. Chris, I wanted to ask you about Australia and Australia's legal obligations. Now, back on October the 10th of 2023, Foreign Minister Penny Wong was asked whether Israel's complete siege was justified, and she responded, "It's always very difficult from over here to make judgments about what security approach other countries take." In January of 2024, Australia suspended funding to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, based on untested Israeli allegations that some of its staff participated in the October 7th attacks. But last month, Australia signed on to a joint statement by donor states that called on Israel to allow a full resumption of aid into Gaza immediately. And early this month, Wong said that Israel's ongoing restriction on aid into Gaza is costing lives, and she announced donations to UNICEF and a Jordanian charity to provide aid to Gaza's people. In your view, is this adequate? And could you talk to us about what Australia's legal obligations are in relation to Israel's siege and what more this country could do to prevent the starvation of Gaza's people?
Let me say to begin with that I have been encouraged by the shift in Australia's government, the Australian government's position during the course of the 20 months now of warfare. It was not as difficult as the Foreign Minister thought back in October 2023 to form judgments as to what was happening. But I won't focus on that. I'll focus on the fact that now, finally, we are getting towards the right position, but still not far enough. In July last year, the International Court of Justice provided its advisory opinion at the request of the General Assembly on the general question of Israel's occupation. It said, for example, that Israel was occupying Gaza. So even before hostilities began in the current round of fighting in October 2023, the court was satisfied that Gaza was occupied. Now, the court's order or opinion expressed in July last year was very clear in speaking about continuing unlawfulness in Israeli actions and the responsibility that that imposed on other states. It said that Israel was violating peremptory obligations, that is, binding absolute obligations applicable in all circumstances under international law, and that this imposed obligations on all other states not to aid and assist the unlawfulness of Israeli actions in any way. I would have expected that the immediate response to that by other states would be a comprehensive, rigorous review of all aspects of the relationship between that state and the state of Israel, with a view to determining what parts of that relationship were in any way aiding and abetting the unlawful actions of the Israeli authorities, and then ending those aspects of the relationship, ending those things that were aiding and abetting the unlawfulness. But there is no indication whatsoever that the Australian government undertook such a review. It certainly has not published the results of such a review. And any actions taken by the Australian government since then are absolutely minimal. So whether we talk about general obligations under customary international law, or the obligations that we have as a state party to the Geneva Conventions and to the Genocide Convention and to the human rights treaties, we have obligations not to in any way be complicit in the criminality of Israeli authorities' actions. And we've simply not taken those actions. So there is a review task, an urgent task, not something that is going to spin out over a number of years. We are already almost a year late in undertaking that work, but it needs to be done urgently and it needs a response. So the Australian government in its policy position, in its public statements, is getting clearer and is being more consistent with the approach taken by the community of nations as a whole. But there is still a long way to go in translating policy or words into actions.
And Chris, how do you explain that failure? Why do you think that that review that you mention into which of our relationships may be aiding and abetting Israel's unlawfulness has not taken place? Why has Australia not taken action to ensure that we are meeting our own legal obligations?
In part, it's in the words of the foreign minister that you quoted, we are a long way away. But that's really no excuse. The Prime Minister has used the same words on many occasions,
Yeah.
but that's no excuse. And even the standard of being a long way away is ridiculous in the face of the fact that we are a small planet and that the actions of one state and the actions in one part of the planet affect others as well. And the obligations that we have apply to our planet as a whole. We know that in relation to climate change, for example. We know how the actions of one state can affect the well-being of others. So it falls into the same category. The excuse, and it's only an excuse of distance, simply does not apply. There are things that we can do, that we should do, and that we haven't done. And we can't simply say we're a long way away. Clearly, we are not as intimately involved in the situation in the Middle East as many other countries are, the United States, for example, or even European states. But that doesn't excuse us from looking at those areas where we are involved, where we have a direct link, and where our direct link is contributing in a complicit way to Israeli authorities' unlawful activities. And then we have an obligation under international law to address those.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and I'll keep referring to it as the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation because I think, as most established humanitarian organizations have said, there is very little humanitarian about this organization. But earlier this year, Israel's Security Cabinet approved a new militarized aid delivery system, which was explicitly designed to displace the existing aid infrastructure in Gaza, and particularly the UN infrastructure and UNRWA specifically. Now, this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has a board of directors with experience in finance, US national security, corporate law, and in only one case, humanitarianism. And the day before this foundation was launched, its executive director, Jake Wood, who was himself a former US sniper, announced that he was resigning because, in his words, it had become clear that it is not possible to implement this plan while also strictly adhering to the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Now, this was something that established humanitarian organizations had been saying since this plan was launched. Now, the distribution sites of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation are secured by private US military contractors, and they've become scenes of regular massacre by Israeli forces. Now, this week, a coalition of Palestinian and international human rights and legal organizations called on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to cease its operations, which they wrote may amount to or facilitate grave violations of international humanitarian, human rights, and criminal law. The organisations warned that failure to do so, and this is a quote, may expose these organisations and their officers, representatives, and agents to further risks of criminal and civil liability for aiding and abetting or otherwise being complicit in crimes under international law, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide in violation of international law, US law, and other relevant national laws under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Chris, can you tell us your views about this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and how you would respond to this call by these organisations?
I think the call by the organisations is very understated. I think the consequences of what's going on at the moment in Gaza are much clearer, and the legal implications of that much stronger than that statement says. This foundation not only represents the privatization of aid, but it represents the militarization of aid. And that's a very serious consequence. Aid has become very much part of the military campaign in the Gaza Strip. And we referred to that already, the way in which our report of June last year indicated that food was being weaponized and the deprivation of food was being used as a weapon of war. And this foundation is just continuing that policy, or perhaps making it even worse. You quoted earlier from a recent statement by the UN humanitarian coordinator in Gaza. Part of that statement was that he described the distribution centres of this foundation as purposefully set up in militarised zones.
Mm.
And that's a very telling statement. It was intentional, and they are in militarised zones. That is, that people going to these centres to obtain aid are at grave risk because there is fighting going on all around them. The UN has said that more than 400 people have been killed in and around the distribution centres. The four that were operating, I think it may be less than four now. In addition, almost 100 others have been killed trying to obtain aid in other parts of Gaza. And over 3,000 people have been injured simply trying to get food to feed families. And this is just since the 27th of May. This is not going back to October 2023. So the situation of aid and the killing and injuring of people in trying to obtain aid is a very serious situation, and is part of the overall campaigning strategy that the Israeli authorities have employed in Gaza. In that report of ours in June last year, we indicated that the military strategy adopted by the Israeli political and military leaders in Gaza was a strategy of total destruction. It can't be described in any way. It commenced with an enormous bombardment campaign by air and sea, and then was supplemented by a destructive campaign by ground forces, including the use of tanks and explosive devices. So it's a campaign that is inherently about the destruction of Gaza. And that being the case, all of Gaza is a war zone, and all those who are in any way involved in the operation in Gaza are suspected of the commission of war crimes, the inevitable consequences of the military strategy that has been adopted. I was in Geneva last week issuing or delivering the latest report from our Commission of Inquiry to the Human Rights Council. And during the course of our comments then, we emphasised the implications of our finding of a year ago that the entire operation inevitably led to the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, what that means is that all those who are engaged in any way in this military operation must be considered suspects in the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. That certainly applies to all Israeli combatants and their commanders, the crews of aircraft, the pilots of drones who may be sitting hundreds of kilometres away, those who are on the ships that are shelling, the soldiers on the streets, tank crews, and those who are manning the checkpoints and the blockade that are preventing the delivery of food, water, fuel, and medical supplies. And exactly the same approach, the exactly same analysis applies to those who are responsible for this, as you say, so-called humanitarian foundation, because this foundation is intimately involved in the starvation strategy of the Israeli authorities. It is intimately involved in the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And anyone in any way involved in the implementation of these policies through the foundation must be suspects in the commission of war crimes. Now, that includes the mercenaries who are inside the compounds, those who are delivering the aid, who are bringing the aid in, but also the decision makers, wherever they are located, including in the United States and in Europe. It's a simple matter of legal analysis, that's all. Who is responsible for the commission of these war crimes? And anybody who is in any way implicated in the commission of the war crimes is a suspect and subject to investigation and prosecution, certainly in the International Criminal Court, because Palestine is a party to the Rome Statute, but also in any court anywhere in the world under the principles of universal jurisdiction. So you referred to the statement by these non-government organisations. I see that statement as understating the legal obligations on these people.
Thank you, Chris. Now, these Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites, as you mentioned, there were originally going to be four. Often they announce that they're being closed. Palestinians are constantly sent messages that they should not go to this particular site because the Israeli military are operating. They should go, they shouldn't go. People are being lured there by the promise of food, only in many cases to be shot or bombarded. Now, these sites, you've just said a lot about their role in the commission of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in the commission of war crimes. It's notable that these sites don't exist, for instance, in North Gaza, which Israel has long attempted to depopulate. And there are serious fears expressed by many that these sites are a means to lure Palestinians through starvation to areas close to the Egyptian border in order to facilitate ethnic cleansing. Would you say that these sites, would you agree that they are or risk being devices of ethnic cleansing or genocide?
I need to pick up a couple of things in your question, Jess. The first is you mentioned that people are being sent messages. Messages are being sent, but there is no guarantee that messages are actually being received.
Yeah.
There is very little electricity in Gaza. People in Gaza are deprived of fuel, and so even generators are not working. But electricity used to be provided across lines coming from Israel, and for most of the time, electricity is being cut off. So even normal devices like mobile phones are not reliable. It's very difficult to charge mobile phones, and sometimes people will try to charge them and use the internet, but the internet is closed down. So people are not necessarily receiving the messages that are being sent, and that has been the case from the beginning, which means that these so-called evacuation warnings that the Israelis claim from the beginning that they have been sending to prevent civilian casualties are nebulous. There is no guarantee at all that people even are receiving them. Secondly, the four sites that did open were all in the south, but the foundation did express an intention to open it. I think it was one site in the centre and one site in the north. That has not occurred, and I have no idea whether the intention was genuine or not, but they have said that there is that intention. Nonetheless, it is certainly clear and publicly stated that the Israeli authorities are drawing people, forcing people into a smaller and smaller area of the Gaza Strip. And they have made no secret of that, as I say. At the moment, 83% of the land in the Gaza Strip, which is very small to start off with, around 360 square kilometres, about half the size of Canberra. And there were, at the beginning of the war, 2.3 million people in that area. We don't know how many are left. But even so, even though it's such a small territory, 83% of it is either a totally militarized zone or subject to Israeli forced evacuation orders. So 17% only of the territory of Gaza is considered to be a safe zone by the Israeli authorities, and the population of Gaza is being forced into that remaining 17%. most of it is a sandy strip along the coast, not an urban area where there is housing, although there's not much housing left anyway, but a sandy strip along the coast in southern Gaza. It doesn't stretch right across the Gaza-Egypt border. A small part of it abuts the militarized zone between this Al-Mawasi humanitarian area and the Gaza border. It's more a narrow strip that stretches up the Mediterranean coast from southern Gaza into central Gaza. As I say, a very, very small area of land. The first purpose of that, it seems to me, is the clearance of the rest of Gaza so that the Israeli military can completely control it and increasingly destroy it. There has been enormous destruction of all of the civilian infrastructure of Gaza. Our report to the General Assembly in October last year detailed what we considered to be a concerted destruction of all health infrastructure in Gaza. Our report to the Human Rights Council, which we presented last week, looked at the destruction of education and educational infrastructure, including all universities, and now something like 95% of schools have either been destroyed or severely damaged. And then extending beyond that to housing, the estimate of the destruction of housing is equally enormous. So the movement of people is to facilitate that destruction. I don't think we can call it ethnic cleansing, simply because where are people to be cleansed to? All the borders are closed. And I also don't think that the purpose is to force people into Egypt, because the Egyptians have made it very clear that the Egyptian border will not be opened to refugees from Gaza. This is almost unlike any other situation of warfare anywhere in the world. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, Ukrainians were able to flee, and they did in their millions, into Poland and other parts of Europe. When the Syrian civil war was at its peak, millions were able to cross the border, principally into Turkey, but also into Lebanon. There is nowhere for the people of Gaza to go. All of the borders are closed, from the southern border into Egypt to the northern and eastern borders into Israel, and the Israelis are maintaining a naval blockade. So it can't be considered ethnic cleansing because people have nowhere to be cleansed to. They are being confined to this very small area where they are still subjected to bombardment. It's not as though they're safe there at all, but for the purpose of total control. That is the principal underlying purpose. And the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation set up food relief centres in the south, in these militarized areas, can only be facilitating that process by this offer of food at great risk in places where it is available on occasion, as distinct from the rest of the Gaza Strip where it is not.
Thank you. There have been numerous reports over the past, coming up to 2 years, of Israeli attempts to displace Palestinians from Gaza to third countries, a whole raft of different countries that have been mentioned. Obviously, Egypt, which, as you say, has made very clear that it does not intend to open its borders. The last one I heard was Libya. Do you think that Israel has given up on those plans, or do you think that there is still a possibility that it is seeking another country that it can displace people from Gaza to?
Those plans were never real. Those plans were simply rhetorical. Sending people to Sudan or South Sudan, come on. It's just all part of the game. There are only two countries in the world that can conceivably take people from Gaza. The first is the United States of America, and the second is Israel. They're the two places that could take people from Gaza. And many people from Gaza, given that 85% of the population of Gaza are refugees or the descendants of refugees from Israel, it may well be that they would be willing to leave Gaza to go home to the areas that they were forced from in 1948. So if the Israelis want the people out of Gaza, let them go to Israel. And if they were serious in protecting civilians and not imposing civilian casualties in the course of their war against Hamas, then they would have allowed them into Israel. And if Trump wants to move people out of Gaza, let him offer them asylum in the United States. Some might be prepared to go there. There's a large Palestinian population in the United States. So Israel and the United States are the only two possible places where people from Gaza might be prepared to move, but no other state is prepared to take them.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about international law. So back in October of 2024, the Palestinian human rights lawyer Raja Sourani warned that Gaza risks becoming what he called the graveyard of international law. Now, since then, we've seen that Israel has committed a litany of war crimes while ignoring orders of the International Court of Justice and a March 2024 resolution of the UN Security Council, which demanded an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan. The United States has imposed sanctions on the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and certain of its judges for issuing arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. Last I heard, the chief prosecutor was unable to access his email. And numerous states continue to supply Israel with arms and to engage in military trade with it, as well as failing to review their relations, as we just discussed, in the light of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. So I wanted to ask your view on this. Has Gaza become the graveyard for international law?
Raji Sourani is an excellent international human rights lawyer and really an international human rights hero. He has struggled for decades to defend the human rights of Palestinians, particularly Palestinians in Gaza. And his analysis is a very strong analysis. I would, however, go further. Yes, Gaza is the graveyard of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, but there are other places that are contributing seriously to the attack on international law and its collapse. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is another example of that, a very clear-cut example of that, of another major state, another permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, totally ignoring its legal obligations under international law. So it's not as though the Gaza situation, the situation in Palestine as a whole, is alone in seeing the destruction of international law. I would say broadly that we have never seen a time since 1945, when World War II ended and the modern era of international law began. We have never seen a time since then when international law, the international legal system, have been under such threat. It seems that regrettably, we're moving from a rules-based international order to a fools-based international order.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about a number of initiatives that have taken place in the last several months in attempts to break Israel's siege of Gaza. Recently, Israeli forces seized the boat, the Madeleine, in international waters as it sought to deliver aid to Gaza and detained its crew. Also, this month, people from 50 countries who were attempting to march to Gaza to deliver aid were blocked in Egypt, with many facing arrest and deportation. A current Malaysian initiative is seeking to mobilize 1,000 boats for a new flotilla to break the siege. And Palestinian human rights and civil society organizations have made a unified call for a diplomatic humanitarian convoy to halt what they call the deliberate starvation of Gaza's people. And recently, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakhri, called on the UN General Assembly to use the Uniting for Peace provisions to pass a resolution calling for UN peacekeepers to accompany humanitarian convoys and deliver the necessary aid into Gaza, regardless of Israel's plans and permissions. That's a quote from Michael Fakhri. So I wanted to ask about your views of such initiatives and how you would answer the question animating this webinar of what will it take to end starvation in Gaza?
I think the call from the Special Rapporteur is a strong one and one that I would support. UN peacekeepers are appropriate means to provide for protection and security in situations like this, and they have been used in that way in the past. I doubt whether the flotilla idea, the march idea, have very much prospect of success, simply because of the strength of the Israeli blockade. I would fear that in those circumstances we would see people, innocent people, being hurt or killed. We saw that in the case of an earlier flotilla from Turkey back, I think it was 2014 or 2018, during that period where people were killed when Israeli commandos boarded the ship. And I admire the courage of those who put themselves in those situations, but I certainly don't want to be encouraging it. I felt relieved when, in the recent case of the ship that was trying to get to Gaza, was stopped by the Israelis and the people were taken prisoner and then deported. That was in violation of international law, but it was better than killing them. So I think that the answer lies not in those kinds of actions, whose principal intent really is to draw attention internationally to the situation, but more in using the processes of the United Nations itself. I agree with the rapporteur that a Uniting for Peace resolution is the way to go, simply because that process was established within the UN as an alternative approach when the Security Council was deadlocked. Now, these days, the Security Council is always deadlocked. It is a totally dysfunctional body because of the vetoes wielded by the Permanent Five. So it's long past time when we consider that anything useful will ever come out of the Security Council. That means that the alternative processes through the General Assembly are the only processes that are likely to work, and some form of international peacekeeping initiative that protects humanitarian workers is an appropriate way to go at this stage. But pressure on the state of Israel in every form is necessary. Because the Security Council is dysfunctional, states cannot sit back and wait for Security Council action. I go back to the earlier point I made that after the International Court of Justice last July issued its advisory opinion, there should have been action taken by states individually and in groups to enforce the decision of the International Court of Justice, taking action to stop all aid and assistance to Israel's unlawful actions. And that hasn't been done. Anything that we can do that increases the pressure on the state of Israel and the Israeli authorities needs to be taken urgently and seriously, and not incrementally. We are well past the stage where we can take little steps by way of incremental action. We need serious, urgent, dramatic action by individual states and groups of states.
On the incremental action, last week, earlier this month, Australia announced sanctions onto Israeli ministers, the Finance Minister Smotrich and Security Minister Ben-Gvir. This was added to the individual sanctions on 7 settlers, which had been imposed earlier. Many people, and I was certainly one of them, were of the view that this simply was not enough and that we need sanctions upon the state of Israel itself. What role do you think there is for sanctions in putting that pressure on the state of Israel?
I think sanctions on individuals are important in sending a message.
Sure.
I was very pleased to see Smotrich and Ben-Gvir at last being sanctions, at least by those 5 states. There should be sanctions against a larger number of individuals. The entire Israeli government's cabinet should be sanctioned. The military leadership should be sanctioned. Those in the Israeli parliament who are passing resolutions that are contrary to international law should be sanctioned. But these kinds of sanctions are more symbolic than anything else. The real sanctions that are needed are sanctions, again, to reiterate my earlier point, actions that end any aid or assistance we are providing to the continuation of Israel's unlawful activities. Now, I'm not talking here about general sanctions that are perhaps pressure points. I'll leave that. I see that as a political issue, and I'll leave that aside. What I am talking about is the legal issue. We have a legal obligation not to be complicit in breaches of international law. And anything that we are doing that is complicit, that is aiding or assisting violations of international law, we have a legal obligation to stop. So I'll leave the politics to the politicians and I'll talk about the law. And that's what the law requires.
Thank you very much, Chris. Now we're almost out of time, so I just wanted to ask whether there's anything that you'd like to add.
We've covered a very, very wide area, Jess, in the course of the, whatever it is, 45, 50 minutes. I don't want to add anything specific, but I do want to finish with something general. You know, you and I were having a chat before we went on air about the situation being unbelievable. And, I want to go back to that word unbelievable. Unbelievable is an adjective that we use commonly to say that something surprising has happened. The situation that we have seen over the last 20 months is literally unbelievable. I would never have thought that these days, after all that we have experienced, we would be seeing a situation now like what we have. I knew on the 7th of October, when I first heard word of the quite horrendous attacks by Hamas in southern Israel, attacks which our Commission of Inquiry has said very clearly constituted war crimes, for which the leaders of Hamas and those involved in the attacks should be subject to international criminal prosecution and punishment. No doubt about that. And I expected a very strong Israeli reaction. But I never expected that we would still be talking about this 20 months later, that the Israeli response to the killings of 1,200 people should be the deaths of well in excess of 56,000 people, including 20,000 children. It is literally unbelievable that this is going on. And I think that the response that we have seen from other states and governments, including our own, has simply not measured up to the gravity of what is occurring and is still occurring after 20 months. As you said at the beginning, the situation now is even worse than it was 20 months ago. People are still dying at the rate of somewhere between 60 and 100 people a day. The death toll here, the rate of killing here, is far greater than in any other international conflict except Sudan. It's far greater than we're seeing in Ukraine, for example, and that we have ever seen in Ukraine in the whole length of the war. And yet the response still seems to be so minimal compared to the gravity of the situation. It's about time that we stopped hiding behind the distance that we are from Israel and Palestine and started taking responsibility at a much more serious level as an international citizen. Gareth Evans used to talk about good international citizenship. This is a case where that is needed and where, on the contrary, we are failing.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think we'll leave it on those very powerful words. I'd like to thank you very much for your time and for all the work that you are doing to attempt to enable some form of accountability. I would like to thank all of you for being here today, and thanks to the Australian Human Rights Institute for hosting this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jess. It's been good talking to you.
Pleasure.